everyone. Welcome to Briar House Writes. I'm Becky Parker, and today I have honored to have with us Bruce Jennings, who is the developmental director for CHN Press. Bruce, welcome to the program.
Oh, thank you very much. Thanks very much, Becky. Glad to be here.
Well, I'm glad to have you here. And Bruce, you are also an esteemed writer. You've written many books and poems, publications, and I wanted to ask you today about a particular book that you've written, a poetry collection called What I Would Not Part With. What was your inspiration behind writing that collection?
Yes, well, it is true. I've had an academic career. I've worked for universities and think tanks and so on, and mostly those jobs had to do with writing about ethics and public policy, ethics and medicine, ethics and public health, and so on. So that's been the subject of most of the books that I've done, and I have actually either written or edited now 30 published books. So I've been, very, very lucky and successful in my career that way. I started writing poetry a long time ago, just for fun, and I still write it just for fun and for the love of it. But I did bring out a published volume of poems last year, and I'm very excited about that and proud of that, and in a way. What occasioned it was the death of my wife. We'd been married for 48 years, and she came down with a kind of brain tumor and eventually ended her life. But for about 3 years, maybe longer, well, really longer, I had to help her with things and take care of her as her primary caregiver. And so this poem, these poems that I have collected together to make this book, short book, they were written at different times. And the inspiration for writing them was particular to that poem. And maybe we can talk about that later. But what I wanted to do, in addition to collecting these poems that I thought made sense together, they hung together, I also want to honor my wife and her achievements and her life, which was essential to mine, and also helped a lot of other people, I think. So that was what brought me to collect poems that I'd written sometimes years before and put them together because I felt that they were coherent, they fit together, and they fit together because they were an exploration of my sense of loss, my memory of her, what it means to die. Does it mean that you're completely gone? No, I don't think so. And what does it mean to be able to go home? There's a lot of sort of interconnected themes in the poems. And as I say, I didn't really alter them much for that publication of that book. I did revise a little bit. And at that point, I had in my head, oh, these poems should be linked together. And so I changed some wording that would make that linkage perhaps more apparent to the reader. And now, if you read the poetry book from beginning to end, you see that there's interlinks and foreshadowings and so forth within those poems. And also you'll see, I think, that the sequence that I came up with tells a story. And that surprised me sort of, because I thought of, well, one poem, I'll send it to a journal, another poem. What does it matter what order I put them in the book? 1, 2, 3, 4. I think it gave me an opportunity to tell a story by the sequencing of the poems. And there's a developmental trajectory. Since, yesterday, Martin Luther King Day, the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. Well, there's a short arc in this little poetry book. What does it bend toward? Making something positive out of deep loss.
Well, and one thing that you mentioned was that grief could be a companion. Can you elaborate on what you mean by grief as a companion?
Yes. Well, Obviously, everybody who talks about death and dying and the psychology of grief and so on, there's a great deal of reality to that, and people experience it in different ways. I thought about grief as not an adversary, not a burden, not a sickness, certainly, not an illness that should be cured, a psychological illness that needs to be cured. I don't approach it that way at all. I approach it as as something that manifests itself in different ways to different people, and I was trying to explore and think explicitly about how it manifests itself to me. And it manifested itself to me largely as a companion and a counselor. Grief comes into just a few of these poems, but the presence of it is in every poem. And one has to figure out how to handle loss. So one of the things that I hope that the poetry book as a whole achieves is to give people some insight as to various ways to handle loss, various ways to think about what has happened to you and what has happened to your loved one in ways that aren't simply damaging, but actually, well, it's not a good thing for sure, but it doesn't have to be destructive. It can give you impetus for the next phase of your life that can be positive. And I, like so many people, tend to believe that that's what she would want for me. And that's what I'm trying to articulate and describe at least a little bit in these poems.
And one of the things that I read about your collection was that you talked about that the fact that how lovely she was and how, like you just said, that she would want you to continue a life filled with joy. So, in your other work that you've written, can you tell us about some of the other things because that are important to you in what you do currently, like your work on ethics and your heart for the world? Tell us about that.
Well, my academic work, my teaching work, has been, as I say, on ethical issues in public policy and healthcare and environmental issues, climate change, and so on. And what I'm trying to do, obviously, is promote my understanding of what ethics requires of all of us, and not just as individuals, but also as societies, as institutions. So critical studies of existing politics and law and economics and institutional functioning, that's been my calling, my work over my whole career. I studied political science and philosophy when I was in graduate school, college, and then I got these jobs with universities and research centers. And I promoted these ideas in and through various articles and books that were part of a larger project. I almost always worked in collaboration with people. And I would say the topics I've written most about within sort of bioethics would be questions about decision-making near the end of life, the right to die, the right to refuse life-sustaining treatment and make advanced directives. I've written much about that. Another thing I've written a great deal about is health policy and health insurance, access to health care, and justice and equity. The United States is a very unjust and inequitable society when it comes to distribution of access to needed medical services, not just at the end of life, but through the whole course of life. And that should change. And I've been part of a group of people, writers and thinkers, who've been trying to achieve universal health care, insurance, universal coverage, universal access. The third thing that I've worked mainly on has to do with public health. Public health policy and ethics are different from clinical. Public health worries about the health of populations, large groups of people. Clinical medicine worries about the well-being of one patient at a time, so to speak. Both are very important, both are essential, but public health is very important, as we learned the hard way from COVID. So those have been the main areas of my work and teaching. I think that my poetry is a kind of private meaning. My academic work has to do with public meanings and public problems. If there's a difference to articulate, it may be both of those. But I have seen in my bioethics work what happens to families, what happens to caregivers, what happens to spouses, chronic illness, disability. These are things that our society doesn't support very well, and yet they're well nigh universal things. Almost everybody at some point will face having to care for an elderly parent who is very much impaired, either cognitively or physically, and so forth. So I've seen it sort of through private eye, so to speak, as well as a public policy eye. And I see lots of things that need to be improved in our society from both perspectives.
Well, tell me about your writing processes. How do you go about doing a particular type of writing? Do you and what form of implements do you use?
Well, it's different in these two realms that I've described. In my academic work, I usually am a part of a research group. We do research, we gather information, and then we plan how shall we put this out in our publication. And I'm going to be writing one or more chapters of a longer book. Other people are writing chapters on different topics. So the writing process there is sort of given to me, but then I shape it with my own interests and my own thoughts as I write it. But it's more of a group process. Poetry, you know, I mean, I take a shower and a line pops into my head, and I try to make a poem out of it. For me, and I'm not saying I'm a good poet, I'm not, but just for me, the experience of the fun of it is the spontaneity. So I have no idea that I'm going to write a poem on a given day when I wake up in the morning. And most days I don't. But those that click, my process is I write some lines and I think about where this poem is really going. And I like the lines at first just because they sounded good to me or they were kind of clever. But later on, you try to make something more out of a whole poem, and you shape it and you come back to it. And sometimes I've tinkered with a poem before I sent it someplace to publish for a long time. And I change a word here, I change a word there. But anyway, it's a different process. Both of them are creative, I think. For me, I experience it as creative and therefore joyful and makes me happy until I get the rejection notice from the journal. But you know what I mean? But they are different, and yet they are both part of this great human meaning-making ability that we have.
Well, do you participate in any kind of writers groups or any kind of conferences, workshops to kind of get your writing going?
Well, as I say, for the public work, it has almost always been preceded by a year, 2 years of group task force meetings, experts talking about this and that and the other. And then it sort of all comes together. But with the poetry, only recently have I begun to meet people and then tune in on Zoom and stuff for some poetry reading. We read a poem and to each other and talk about it, and give suggestions about how it could be more effective or better. What are you trying to do? Well, you would do it better maybe if you tried this. That type, if you call that a workshop, I have been in a few of those, and it's helpful. But at the end of the day, I mean, a friend of mine in one of those workshops gave me this book written by a poet, and the first page of the book says, rule number 1, write what you want to write, not what you're told to write. So insofar as I take that advice, I like to listen respectfully and, make changes. But at the end of the day, it's going to be what I want it to be. And I kind of relish that selfishness about my poetry because I don't have that, and it would be inappropriate in the setting of my academic writing.
It's completely separate in a way. in terms of it's your work completely, your thoughts, your processes, and the world wouldn't be the same if it wasn't an original Bruce Jennings. If it was,
Well,
um,
I think the poetry probably does a better job of that than the other. The articles I've written could have been written by any number of people because they have the same body of knowledge in their heads as I do. Um, but with poetry, again, I think it's more intimate, it's more personal. At least I try to make it that way. But I don't make it just, I hope, perhaps our viewers will make a judgment about that in a few minutes. I hope it's not sentimental. I hope it isn't sort of just, um, I hope it, I hope it has a kind of critical edge to it.
I think that I can speak from someone who has been in a group with you. I think that your poems are very thoughtful and that really make you think about what you're reading. So yeah, you don't have to worry about that. So
Okay.
Uh, and speaking of your reading your work, how about we go ahead and listen to you, and we'll take a remainder of our time and listen to you read some of your work, if you don't mind.
Oh, I'd love to do that. Absolutely. I thinking ahead to that, I've chosen to start with a poem which doesn't obviously fit in the collection. It's one of the older poems in terms of when it was first written. And the reason that I want to start with it is twofold. Number one, it gives, if you think about it a little bit, it gives an interesting key to the other poems in this book, what I would not part with. The second reason I want to do it is because of the horrible state of the world and Israel and Gaza and Ukraine and so on. There's something about this poem that it isn't really about my grief and my care for my wife. It is about care for the world. And so if I may, I'll start with that. And then I have a couple of others that'll give you a flavor about the caregiving process and the grief. So this poem is called, where is it? There we go. This poem is called Lost. This poem is called The Children of War. The children of war stare out of wastebaskets throughout the land with jagged eyes. They speak from the forgotten. Peering from these envelopes are eyes with a gaze so steady and so relentless that they see with curled edges. The boy with red hair, baptized at a font of blood flowing from his older brother's chest, pooling in the gutter. The naked girl running on the dry road, her small feet setting off little explosions of dust, fleeing from men who would clothe her in fire. The baby of bones, distracted for a moment, turns away from a mother's withered breast to face the allure of a wave, a whistle, a bright thing. I cannot meet their gaze for long. I hide from these children in the eyes of my own child. They find me nonetheless. They arrive in gravid bellies stamped with my address, and with a sharp edge, I deliver them. Does severing entail connection? If he who puts them in is gone, is he who takes them out the father? I kiss the photographs where all is flat and bottomless. I ache to shape. What if I cannot make these children solid? Then I shall make them into a poem with curled edges. The children of war have no hand to hold but God's. They say to listen closely is to hear from far away. They say metonymy matters more than metaphor. They say for each embrace, a pair of empty arms. So that is the beginning. Let me turn now to an experience about my wife's illness. And then the illness started out with a with a brain tumor, and she had that removed surgically, and we thought things were going to be all right. But later on, it grew back. And so this is after the first surgery, and my wife is in the hospital. This is called Achieving Cancer Mastery. My wife lay reduced, an object of intensive surveillance. The work of the tumor and the work of her surgeon left her silent for a time, and he lost his own articulation. She borrowed time, but tumors are loan sharks who charge compound interest due at an uncertain date. Another price was demanded by the surgeon. This one could be paid if her brain had the resilience to bounce back, and if their love for each other could raise the cash. The part of his brain that is his mind pondered this. It weighed recovery and diminishment, one in each palm. He wondered how blind justice would apportion them. The part of his brain that is the heart was terrified by those proceedings and could not bear to look at them in the face or grasp them with its bare hand. As he walked back toward the elevators to return home, he thought how his wife's future lurked a few floors below in the outpatient oncology waiting room, a place close enough to hell to read the sign above its entrance, a place where the blind sisters spin. Soon enough, he would become a waiter and a watcher in those regions and learn its lessons. The lesson of Prometheus, for instance. The reason human beings lack foresight is that if they had it, they would have no hope. The lesson he learned only when it was too late. Achieving cancer mastery is managing to love and be loved. For this, one needs to learn to value waiting for its own sake. One needs to endure overhearing others in the world of chairs, weeping on their cell phones, lingering helpless until denial is finally broken and retreats in disarray. So let's see, maybe
We have about 10 minutes left, Bruce.
Okay, we got time for the two, they're a little bit shorter than the other ones. The first one is called Widower's Lot. And it's actually the last poem in the collection, but I'm going to jump back and do this a little bit out of order. Oh no, okay, I'll tell you what. I'll just do these two short ones. The first one I'll read is called Remontancy, and the second one is called Widower's Lot. Remontancy, by the way, is a word that refers to the fact that some plants can blossom more than once during a growing season. Marriage and parentage behind, freedom as you please ahead. Where do you turn? Master of meeting, no need to persuade. Who's there as you walk alone? Escaping friction is your fiction. It has no traction, so you flail without moving forward. Does the stasis of your life become you? Early morning sun, blue bright, after the ice storm. Step into a diamond, marvel a crystalline world. For no reason, you go to a mailbox you rent for no reason. Will you open the letter you hope to find? So that's Remontancy. And now finally, Widower's Watch. A widow gets the topmost room of houses above the harbor of New Bedford and Martha's Vineyard, where she recalls watching over the waves and awaiting the man whose life she has shared with the sea. A widower watches in the basement room, and remembers how the woman anchored their household. In this room, a wash tub stands dry and idle, and ball jars of preserves she put up sit patiently on shelves. She worked from below. He feels the buried supports of the life she provided for him. They still give him footing, and they remind him of the subterranean strength of her love. Widows watch for one who will not arrive. Widowers adrift at sea long to be watched for again.
That's lovely.
There
Well,
you go.
Bruce, thank you so much for reading those. I wanted to ask you one very last question, which is if you could visit any past time period, where would you go and how would you spend your time?
Well, do you remember? I forget the title of the movie, but Woody Allen years ago did a movie, and his character wanted to get out of the present, and he went back to the 1920s in Paris, where the great, artists and writers and painters were blossoming at that time. And he meets people, and he finds out that this is a pretty rotten place, also. And he thinks that I've got to go back to the 1870s Paris, because in the 1870s there was a great renaissance of intelligence and writing and art and everything. Also, he thought maybe you should go there. And he finally ends the film by realizing that no place is inherently worse or better than where you are right now. You have to stick it out. And so I thought that was an interesting moral of the story for Woody Allen in his movie. And I'm mindful of it as I think about your question. I suppose if we could go back a little ways and then try to change history and do better, I think maybe I would pick the late 1960s and the early 1970s in the United States, because then we were on the cusp of making a social justice breakthrough in our society in terms of the distribution of resources and wealth and so on. And frankly, the Vietnam War ruined it. And the politics changed then. And so by the time we got 10 or 15 years later, we were in a very different world and a very different politics. I think we had a crucial window there between, say, 1965, 1964, 65, and 1980. If we had used that window or been able to use that window differently, we would have ushered in more social legislation. We got tremendous civil rights legislation, environmental legislation, health legislation, Medicare and Medicaid.
Mhm.
We did tremendous things. The Congress did tremendous things, but we lost the opportunity to go all the way to a universal healthcare system, for example. And maybe we could, if we had a second chance, if we had a remontancy on that one, we might do different.
And you never know what the world can do in the next 20 years, Bruce. There's always hope, right? As long as there's breath, there's hope.
That is right. And that's why I will open that letter that I hope to find. Yes.
Well, thank you so much for meeting with me. And Bruce, quickly tell us where you can be found.
Where I can be found?
Yes.
Well,
In New
I
York
do,
today, but where else normally? Like on social media, where can we find you?
yeah, I do. I do have a website, a web page. It's pretty simple. It's brucejennings.org. Is all you need nowadays, I guess. And it sort of shows you all the books I published, and you could send me an email if you have a particular question. And in the future, I'm going to try to put more on this website, just like maybe a recording of our conversation, Becky, today, and some other things. So maybe I'll put up some poems that I haven't published, but I'll just share with everybody on that website. So that's one way to do it. And in terms to get the book, What I Would Not Part With, that I've read a couple from, it's available really at all the major places: Amazon, Google, iBooks, and it's available in all the different formats. I do have an audiobook version
Mhm.
that you can get if you prefer to listen on your long commute. um, and also, hardback, paperback, and ebooks and Kindle books. So it's pretty easy to get to. And the poem, the title comes from a poem by Robert Frost. He's got a poem when she says, "What I would not part with, I should keep, or I have kept."
Mhm.
And I use the first part of that as the title because um, my wife isn't entirely gone. And there are certain things about her life and about her person that I'm not going to let go of and would not part with. And so that's just fine. It just makes you think about what it means to be alone differently, and it makes you think about what it means to be together with someone differently. Um, and in that first poem of the book, grief, the counselor says, don't give up with your own life. Let the perseverance of your life affirm the worth of hers. And so that's the spirit of this book. And the you can get it, as I mentioned. And if you don't find it, or if you don't want to go to one of those places, you can check it out on my website, and then there's links to where you could find it.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Bruce, and I hope the day goes wonderful for you in New York.
Well, happy shoveling there in Nashville.